recent years. And Ozan will ask you great questions. He has prepared a great list of questions. So thank you for all, and stage is yours.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Welcome, Stan. Good to see you again. In every call, every webinar, I try to find a T-shirt that fits best the topic that we're going to discuss. And I think that this was probably the best one. It's kind of what you had been personally doing for a long while, helping companies bring out heroes all over the planet, which are not born in the same place, which do not necessarily live in the same place, but which do have certain vision, similar vision and similar mission in life. So the way I look into your recent past with Teleport and now Topia is more like you're trying to bring the heroes around the world into and under one bridge with one mission. So would you just want to start telling us what you guys are doing recently? And for those who haven't had the opportunity to read or watch your talk on Startup Istanbul, who are you, what you're up to, will be a quick story.
Yeah, it's a great pleasure to be here. I'm a lifelong software entrepreneur. I started my first company when I was 18 and never looked back. I've been building my own companies, helping others to build theirs. The biggest story that I've been lucky to be part of this far was Skype. So I joined Skype very early on as a startup and stayed there for almost 8 years, sort of seeing it bloom into this sort of global brand and the software used by hundreds of millions of people every month. And coming out of that Skype story, now 6 years ago, I started sort of thinking, okay, where do I want to put my next decade? And decided that my interests and passions lie around building a more open and borderless world. So I started a company called Teleport with a few friends, and we started building software for humans on the move to figure out where in the world they should live and how do they get to where they should be and so forth. And in 2017, we got acquired by a company that is now called Topia. Mm-hmm. The vision and the mission are still very, very much the same, sort of enabling people to work anywhere and be where they can make most of their potential. But the format has changed a bit. So at Teleport, we started with the consumers, and at Topia, we found that the business model is around large enterprises for this phase. So basically, at Topia, we build software for very, very large companies, Fortune 500, Fortune 2000 companies, to figure out where their employees are, where they should be, move them around the planet. And we provide this software layer that helps them to stay compliant and understand their costs and so forth, and then interconnect with all these physical companies that move people around. So we're sort of the software layer on top of mobile talent management. Series D raised about $100 million now, acquired several companies, and so it's been a pretty crazy ride.
Yeah. And I've been watching a few of your talks and especially the acquisition blogs and your Stanford journey. And there are a lot of stuff that I would like to go through. But before that, first, the famous, the one who should not be named is now the COVID. And I'm guessing your business is probably you're running without looking where you're running towards, because of all the push that I'm expecting the corporates. You must be swamped with leads. You must be swamped with lots of questions. You've been doing webinars to educate large corporates on how they can actually start doing that with a lot of content. So how do you see the world understanding evolved because of the virus? And then mobility was always a trend that was kind of steamrolling you before COVID, but now it's like a different planet. How do you feel that's happening?
Yeah, like the first thing we saw in March was that movement very abruptly stopped. People who were getting on a plane and the plane didn't leave the airport, like physically you couldn't move. People got stuck in very weird places where they planned to be for 2 weeks and they ended up being 2 months and so forth. but that's sort of, I would say that stalling happened in the next level down. At the same time, on our level and sort of building software to manage these mobility programs, we saw that the demand actually, as you say, goes up, because all of a sudden you need to answer very quickly questions like, okay, who on a Turkish passport do I have in Germany right now? And who's going to run out the visa in Brazil? And sort of, because movement stops and the information problems actually get more intense. Yeah. And I think that will actually continue in the next sort of 18, 24 months for sure. Like the way I think about it is that the planet already is, and it will be for foreseeable future. You can imagine it as sort of a globe with the red and green spots on the surface. Yeah. And if a country has had a COVID wave, they get it under control, they start opening up their business, it turns more green. And if somebody has the second wave coming along, they get very self-obsessed when you're trying to maintain and contain it internally. So it's, again, you're turning red. And green zones, green countries, green cities will start communicating and doing business with each other very, very quickly again, because it's a very open and interconnected planet. And the red zones are kind of cut off. And so as I think about our sort of what we can do to help our customers, then it's the stuff like understanding which zones are green and which are red and who do you have where. So I think that's a very simple task. And I think it only will start like structurally better once we do have medical solves. Like once there is a vaccine, then things can change. But before that, no way.
Yeah, and even with the vaccine, I mean, flu has been impacting a lot of people, and there's no universal flu medicine, and it just kills a lot of people. Although it had been a pandemic in like locally, actually it's not a pandemic, but it's a locally disturbing event. Now it's just a different stage. And right. I agree with your cautious optimism or cautious pessimism. 18, 24 months will be an estimated good timeline to see there's a kind of permanent solution to this. But before that, the corporates are now struggling to even figure out how to solve work from home limitations. Some are opening up by 20% capacity, changing people back and forth. Many are just saying, you know what, let's not do this office thing anymore. Do you see that the world will change from a real estate-minded workplace to a remote-minded workplace because of this?
Yeah, I think there is this Ernest Hemingway quote from many, like, I can't remember which of his books, but if the question is like, how did you go bankrupt? Then the answer is like for 2 years, really, really slowly, and then really, really rapidly. So I think it's the same that we're seeing with work. Like when we started Teleport, we made an explicit decision that we will be a distributed team. We don't care where people work. We talk about output and measure goals and output rather than the hours put in and so forth. So and already at Skype for like mid 2000s, because we were building tools that allowed us to work anywhere. By the time we had 200 people, we were in 10 locations in like 2004, 2005. And that for me, it's completely normal and natural. And because of that has been happening for 10, 15 years, the tools have become better, the collaboration mechanisms, the processes, the habits, the people's capacity, and like if you want to learn about it, like things you can read online and so forth. But like this has still happened in a very, very sort of isolated corner, like early stage tech or some small parts of the industry. And now all of a sudden, like massive banks with tens of thousands of employees need to figure out how to operate in that environment as well. And luckily for them, all these tools now exist, all this knowledge already exists. Yeah. So because of that, I think this change can be really quick. I think there is still a huge part of physical collaboration, like, and building relationships. Like I've always had this sort of learning or sort of thought that you can build relationships face to face and then you can maintain them by video calls. Like the opposite is much harder. It's possible, but it's harder. And so, like the way we've currently shut down our offices completely in New York, London, and Dublin, and I don't think we've decided not to restore them this year, and we'll see from there. In other locations like San Francisco and Tallinn, we have longer term leases, and so we're reinventing how we use those spaces. So maybe it's like every team goes in for 1 day a week to do the sprint planning and whiteboarding and all these things, and then they work from home for 4 days a week, or then they meet in a park somewhere when the weather is nice. Like we give people much more freedom, and I think those behaviors will now penetrate the more conservative, bigger organizations who have said that maybe 1 day, but it will take our efficiency down. Now they have like 3 months of data if it actually worked or not. And if there's one progressive employee who wants to try something new, it's very hard for their manager to shut them down with the argument that it won't work.
Yeah, I think one element that I've seen in when I was living in San Francisco is sometimes I felt like that's another planet, not even a normal city. It has its own behavior patterns. It jumps into new bandwagons, the spaceships, whichever they find faster. And I never thought the trickling down effect into real life, real corporates, large entities will be super long. And that's the gap could only be passed if there's enough financing. That famous chasm, I think, has been into the mainstream, has pushed the work from home mechanics, mindset, tools, now into the mainstream companies, and the late adopters will there's no chance for late adopting anymore. You just had to adapt in 2 weeks.
Yeah.
And it's like what your manager said, what your CEO said, what your CIO said. No, it's just because the wire said we're now shifting to work from home, and you guys need to figure out a way to be productive because we still have a job and we need to keep doing what we're doing. So I think that
on a broader scale, it's also about staying competitive. Like Absolutely. Now we're entering a phase where you can be a large corporate and say that, okay, we won't change. Like pandemic ended, let's get everybody back to the office. You might not lose half of your talent. You might lose 10% of your top talent because they will join companies who will allow them to work how they want. So
absolutely. So shifting gears, are you still using Skype or have you shifted to Zoom?
I still have, like the other day I was searching for Skype on my computer and I didn't have it. I think I have it on my phone. Occasionally I still have somebody who proposes to talk via Skype, but I guess the world also has sort of evolved notably in the sense that like in a sense you don't care. Like you guys sent me a link to something that is called Click Meeting. I've never used it before, but if it's just a URL that you click and the video call happens, then basically you take whatever link is in the meeting invite and you think less about which software did you now open, right?
So we keep chatting about this. My daughter is using a different software for the school.
Yeah.
With Burak, I'm using Click Meeting. With friends, I'm using something else. But every time I use something else, I always I have the intention to go back to something that actually works. And that's kind of frustrating for probably a Skype mafia people after takeover. I mean, there's lots of blog posts about why Skype has not been the new Zoom. But I think every large technology company goes through this cycle in a way.
Yeah, and I don't think anybody from the early team looks back with regret at anything. It was like an amazing ride. It was a long ride. We changed the world literally. Like you had this sort of feedback loop of anywhere you go in the world, people were using what you built, and that was amazing in its time. Like companies start and then grow, and then many of them die and others get acquired or go public, and with all of those phases something new happens. So like no regrets, and whatever is more innovative wins.
Yeah, it's the time that's passed since we were addicted to Skype in our day-to-day life versus now is really short, and maybe it's a good thing, maybe it's a bad thing, and it kind of links me to one of the blog posts you had when you were having the Stanford program. It's like there are 5 W's in entrepreneurship. If you look at from that lens again, and if you're going to give advice to founders who are either joining on Startup Istanbul's program or other programs, where do you think they should focus on their W's? You talked about the where. It's global now, in a sense, as long as we can travel from red zones to green zones or green zones to whatnots. We are a little bit more mobile, but maybe that will not be possible with visa restrictions, with nationalism rising in Europe and US. Where do you see the opportunities, especially for startups in that sense?
Specifically about the where?
Yeah. Where or what should they be doing?
Well, the where definitely has become more democratic, and less people have to care about where they are. Like, they should be where it's right for them. And sometimes it's where it's right for the business. Like when you're building an enterprise SaaS company targeting the US market, then building a sales force anywhere else than US, it's going to be very hard or kind of pointless. But like if you're building a consumer product, this can literally come from anywhere. If you're building an enterprise product, you can live in one place and you can hire people in other places where you need to. So I think it's become more democratic, more long-tailed. Definitely places where you can raise money. That list of those places has grown, multiplied in the last decade. It used to be that it's only US. Now it's literally like 20, 30 hubs around the world where you have decent local venture capital willing to take risks. So that part, I think, has spread out nicely. And in some ways, when I look back at what we were saying and thinking in the beginning of the teleport, like many of those things are materializing now. Silicon Valley is a fantastic place for many reasons, like the amount of talent already there, and talent with experience of taking companies through later phases, and venture capitalists who have seen several cycles. Like these are amazing assets to build them, but these are not like universal. These are not differentiating enough anymore. So even in the Valley, I see and I hear from my investor friends that more and more they see teams where the founders might be raising there, but like the team is somewhere else. They all spread out. Which was like a yellow flag 6-7 years ago, and now it's like the normal. Oh, you're handling the capital smartly.
So we talked about the talent and funding gaps that you can now close a little bit more easily compared to 10 years ago. From the governance and from growth and regulation standpoint, I think the catching or the pursuit of talent has also impacting countries, not just companies. Do you think there will be like leading countries? I know, like you will want to mention Estonia, what they've been doing for a long while. Do you think that's a model that other countries can copy and focus on building startup ecosystems in their own native land, or does that even matter? Like, do I need to be in Estonia to be affiliated to Estonia in a mindset way?
Yeah, I think, well, like let's look at Estonia for a second. It's like the first year where we tracked venture capital investments, early stage tech investments, was 2006. So Skype was 2003, 2005 it got acquired by eBay. 2006 were the first sort of officially tracked. I think we raised $6 million in the country of 1.2 million people, 400,000 in the capital. $6 million went into early stage startups and looked crazy enough. Over the last 3 years, it's been $300 million a year, 300 million euros a year. So since 2006, in this last 14 years, I think we've raised about 1.2, 1.4 billion euros in capital. The country is still the same size. So it shows that, first of all, capital from abroad started flowing into a place where stuff was happening.
Yeah.
That in turn created a local capital. So there are many more angel investors. The local VC funds. Now I think there is, when the crisis started, the local VC said that in the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, there's right now 700 million euros of local dry powder. So just bring the projects. And that in turn, when this company started growing, then we got really aggressive on the startup visas as entrepreneurs and talked to the government. And we were very quick as a country to fix that. So we've had the visa for 2.5 years now, 3 years maybe even. And there are now about 2,000 people who have moved from abroad to work for Estonian startups, and a few hundred founders who have moved to start their companies. So it's like this spinning wheel, or like the snowball. When an ecosystem takes off, it starts taking off on capital, people, founders, employees, like all of these things. And I think that grows. And I think generally, to a policy question, what I found is that the best policy is for the government to get out of the way. Like, if the visas are blocking, fix the visas. Like, if the taxes are blocking, fix the taxes. Like, get out of the way and let the entrepreneurs do what they do best and build the companies. So Estonian government at some point was involved in venture funds, started Estonian Development Fund and was aggressively in the market. But it was also set up in a structure that once we get the market going, we'll get out of the way, which is, I think, it's sort of the Israeli model from the 70s, where government started many things, but the second the market started behaving like a market, then the government left the market and left it to the private investors. So I think that pattern really works. And one thing to add there, like as far as the where and where should you be, like I think this COVID situation has shown that once you have the relationships and you have built the relationships with the investors, for example, then you can raise money also in the crisis, and everybody looks at the numbers and say, okay, this is like a 6-month delay in what you were planning to build. Okay, we'll fund you. But it's a little bit harder when you start building these relationships when you're already in trouble. Yeah. So I think the main learning there, it matters less if you're in Istanbul or Tallinn or London or Berlin, but if you've been working on your network and sort of making sure that you have these people that already know you and your company when you go to them, like then I think, again, like if people have been following your progress, it again matters less of where you happen to be at the time when you call them.
I moved to San Francisco to run an early stage fund and accelerator in 2016, and we partnered with Draper University, and I worked with in one of the programs. And Tim was very proud to say he's one of the few first non-Europeans to get the Estonian e-residency, and he was talking about this like Bitcoin, cryptocurrency. Landless countries like Estonia, in that sense, will change how founders. And this was like 4 years ago. And now we're seeing everybody is now talking in significant terms. And okay, how are we going to get this rolling on a massive scale? What countries should do? I think each country has one way or another is trying to build their own cryptocurrency. And when you have people moving, when you have money moving freely, we will have a better world. But what should we be working on to get that applied much faster, like from an individual activist perspective, for example, or from a startup advocate perspective?
I think one macro thing that will get broken very, very soon, or it's already broken, but most countries have not noticed it. But like from one side, in order to build good environments where to live, like where you have good schools and hospitals and roads and all these things, you need to have a tax base. Like there are these things that we build as a societies or as countries or as cities. And at the same time, these trends that you're explaining, like this startup movement becoming more borderless and e-residency and programs like that, they very distinctly detach what's the place where the value is created from the physical location of a person. And what I mean by that is that if you have a Pakistani e-resident who has never been to Estonia but is running a digital entity in Estonia, and then serves a German software house with their code who is serving a customer in Argentina, and now you imagine that they get paid in DAI or USDC or like Ethereum 20 token that happens to be pegged to a fiat currency somewhere. Like nowhere in like even for the people involved, it becomes like a nice sort of puzzle exercise to try to sort of fairly think where the value was created. Yeah. But it's completely hopeless for the governments involved. And it's not like something that you can enforce by force. Like you cannot sort of come and take this, like if you are the Argentinian government and you believe that there is some tax issue, the tracing back that the sort of German contractors, Estonian subcontractor happens to live in Pakistan and sort of figuring out, like having a argument with them is near impossible. And at the same time, I believe that the people inherently in those systems are actually good. Like they actually want to have, like the guy in Pakistan would actually want to have a better school for their kids. So it would be fair that some taxes land in those places. And I think this will sort of create this need for this sort of new sort of fabric of how like these nation states and country or government entities and communities talk to their residents, understand the value, decide like what's the fair share, maybe the taxation becoming more of even a voluntary act that you can divert your money where you think is fair. And that creates more competition between governments. Like if you create a better environment, people want to be affiliated with you rather than you have to force them at gunpoint to pay, and like all these sort of things. And Estonian president is very progressive about this, and she's been talking globally about this. And she says that this is like everybody in OECD needs to agree for something to change. And you know how fast that is. So bottom line, I think that's a very, very right field for startups and more progressive sort of government and startup community or things, like offering solutions of how to do that so that the right communities get the share of the value that's created, but in a way that is not like stupid and oppressive, or let's prohibit that sort of behavior, because that ship has sailed.
Yeah, I agree on that one. So moving back to some of the questions that the startups have, if you were to start, I mean, you already had a lot of experience in starting all team remote structures, but if you were to start and maybe avoid some of the initial mistakes that you think has stopped growth or has been problematic in different areas, where would you start with, or how would you design the process of hiring global talent, integrating them into your company as in a very early stage startup? What would be the first three things you should be very cautious as the founder team?
Yeah, I think the good news is that starting it as a very early stage team is way easier than changing a company later. Like what happens is that when you already have 20 people or 50 people or 200 people, and then you add this first remote guy, then or girl, then that doesn't mean that one remote person needs to behave differently, but the rest of the 200 need to behave differently. And that's like a massive change management. And like, it's so easy, like when all the people are in the same office and one person is not there, then they might decide something very important at the coffee machine without even noticing that they didn't tell the other person. And sort of, and this sort of social glue or like building a coherent team is harder and so forth. So in that sense, early stage startups are way luckier because you can design that culture from the ground up. And there is this, I always go back to, there's a distributed team called Lulubot, which I think they started or they borrowed it from the open source movement. Because if you think about it, like open source is the area where there is the longest standing practice of building stuff in a distributed fashion. Like Linux has been built by hundreds and thousands of engineers who have never met each other, commit code, and now millions of servers run on their code. So it's like a pretty successful distributed project. And so borrowing back from that, this Lulubot guys worded their principles, which is write liberally, meet frequently, congregate occasionally. And what this means to me is that write liberally basically means, like, you in a distributed environment, in our tooling age, you cannot hire people who can't write. And by that I mean that if you're writing chat messages and Jira tickets and code comments and everything all day long, like, you better be good at it. Like, you have to be concise, clear, preferably funny. Like, people would want to talk to you over text and so forth. And so that's like, I think the higher level point is that there is a special skill set. Like, you cannot build a distributed team of anyone. You have to actually think about it when you hire, like, what are the qualities you hire for. Then meet frequently means that, like, in a small team, Teleport was maybe 8 people, 10 people, 12 people. As a CEO, I still had like half an hour one-on-one with every single employee every week. We had one team meeting, and there were some other forums that we encouraged. So because you don't have casual run-ins with your colleagues, then you actually need to put in a conscious effort to have that FaceTime. And at the same time, this was very loose. Like, I didn't care if we start the video call and the person continues working and we just work with video on for half an hour. Like that was their time. Like, they told me what they want to talk about. So it wasn't like, hey, tell me what you've done today, kind of a forced meeting. And then the congregate occasionally is that many of the more successful distributed companies get the entire team together once, sometimes twice a year. Which is now going to be messier with the pandemic. But when I used to live in the US, I was back in Europe every other month or so. When, like, last year, 2018, I flew 100 flights. Last year, I flew about 50 flights, but still like a quarterly regime of getting the CEO team together, like stuff like that. It might, like, especially people from outside this work styles, they see it mostly as cost, like, oh, our travel and expense budget goes up. But if you actually calculate it through, if you raise money from London or San Francisco and you build a global team, you probably save a few $1 million a year anyway. So if you put like $500,000 back into organizing team summits twice a year for 100 people or whatever, like, then you are still in the green.
Yeah. And one of the few things that I'm really curious to see how it will flow is, I mean, WeWork have collapsed before this whole COVID thing, and I'm happy that they collapsed before the COVID, because then they'll put the blame only on the COVID, which was not the case. And they were setting not a really progressive or hopeful message, like, get rich soon, just spend the heck out of money. And I think this period will force a lot of startups to think about profitability and creating positive unit economics. And as you mentioned, there's a lot of dry powder. Like, the VCs will keep on funding teams. That's because they have that's their mandate, and they have a 7 to 10 year mandate. It's not like they're going to stop investing for 2 years. That's not going to happen. So I think the VCs are luckier than the startups. But VCs will also probably need to compete more on better deals in that sense. So if you were a VC, or if you are, I don't know if you're angel investing yourself, but what would your first couple of things to look for in a startup team if you're looking to invest? Would you be too concerned about how they will be impacted by COVID, or would you rather take a longer view?
Well, I guess it's still very much like, I don't think there's a universal answer there. Like, I think definitely what I sense from companies I've invested in or friends that are raising money this year and we did a survey among Estonian startups in March, April, and I think half of the startups had less than 5 months of runway. And so that meant that there was a lot of funding that needed to happen. at the same time, if you think that all the hotels and restaurants who were empty overnight, they didn't have 5 months. Like, so in that sense, if 5 months of runway looks scary from outside, and then you think that, okay, for an average hotel, that's probably like 1 month of runway. Like, so it's not that bad. And I think the stronger teams by now all have raised their money. Like they, but it's definitely what's happened is this. The tables have turned. Like, it's not the founders market, it's the VCs market. Like the terms are more tamed. The VCs dictate them more, and there is like I think this sort of your point about having healthier unit economics, like generally being more diligent with cash and being able to show how you are. Like there are companies who had like a year of runway, but they still laid off like 20-30% of their people because they really looked at the burn numbers and said that, okay, even though it's not about the months, like if we go raising more money, like we need to be able to show that we can save like anything we can. There is Bolt is a big Estonian success story. And they now raised a hefty round. They had an up round, so their valuation went from $1 billion to like 1.7 billion. And I think a huge part of their pitch is that, guys, like, look at what we're building as fast as Uber with 10 times less capital. So it's like almost like if you want a capital saving bet in the future of transportation, there's one. Okay, so I think this argument probably plays much better right now than, even though they were capital efficient 2 years ago, but then maybe some investors cared less about that aspect. So,
yeah. And I think from that sense, there's the way I felt it. I mean, living in Turkey and Middle East for a while, and then 3 years in Silicon Valley, I always felt that the Americans are much bolder in putting money on bets that will probably not pay off in unit economics for a very long time. But Europeans were more stringent, and that's why they were kind of blamed for a while by not taking bolder risks. But now that also has changed, because there's a lot of money in Europe now that will be deployed soon. And the principles that they were building, more unit economic positive, more frugal companies, will probably be creating more sustainable companies. But I'm worried a lot about the exit opportunities for lots of the companies, which if there's no exits, then the VC industry will have some difficult times in that sense.
Yeah, and there is like this sort of having these moonshot companies is still super important. Like if everybody goes incremental, like everybody makes some industry like 10% better, then it's boring, and value creation will be low as well. And I think that has been a trap that Europe has been maybe 5-10 years ago. It was much more like in Europe you would celebrate getting to 100 million exit, and in San Francisco or Shanghai you would like consider it a failure almost. And so I think Europe has moved strides from that. And if you look at the last 5 years, the number of unicorns in Europe and companies taking really bold bets and going really, really far, like I think that's necessary. And like somebody needs to go to Mars, like somebody needs to build the next sort of life extension biomedical innovation. And these things take years, and they take hundreds of millions and sometimes billions of dollars of capital, and somebody like that structure needs to exist in the market as well. But it doesn't mean that you're building the next sort of marketing automation app for small businesses, and that means that you need to raise a few hundred million before you start thinking about revenue. Like these are completely, I think, different categories of companies, and they need to be funded accordingly. And in a very frothy market, then also stuff like real estate plays can position themselves as tech companies and get more money than they maybe should.
Yeah. So I'm looking into maybe one of the last questions before we let you go. Do you have any interest in like green energy? Do you see any? That's one of the questions Iman has asked. Are you familiar with that kind of like technology frontier? How will that happen? Or do you want to pass on to last words of wisdom?
Well, green energy, I do have solar panels on my summer home, but I don't know much about it on the industrial or sort of innovation scale. So I think in general, actually, like my general point would be that a year ago we were all arguing around the planet, like, is there global warming, is there not, can we change our behaviors and all that. Now it's super interesting. Over the last 3 months, we have quantifiable data that A, we can change behavior if we want, and B, we can measure like what was the positive effect to the environment if we had X number of planes less flying or energy use dropping or whatever. So that's, I think, the positive like learning we should take out of this entire mess that should feed like this sort of green energy future climate discussions have become very religious at times, and now we should have a lot more data to bring into that conversation, which is good, because I definitely think that we were not living sustainably before. But the so I think like the positive thought maybe to add would be like, usually the best companies are born in a crisis. Like when you're building something that is really, really hard, that it will take you a few years in the lab, like it doesn't really matter what's the price of gas this week or like some other things that some industries are much more worried about. And so getting something going right now when people were laid off, and maybe you can get some like-minded people to work together, very passionate about something, to build something new. I think it's a usually, like, if you look at the history, the 2001, 2002 was a great years. 2009, 2011 were great years to start companies, and that generally tends to happen after big economic crisis as well.
Yeah. So it's like the phoenix rising from the ashes.
Yeah.
If the rest of the economy keeps working, I also agree that there's an opportunity for startups. But those startups who were building something before COVID should now have really reconsidered their priorities, should have reconsidered how they're going to hire, how they're going to grow their companies, and maybe look in different sectors. If they were in travel, maybe it's not the best time to create a travel company that requires people to travel. Maybe you do a virtual travel company. So I think the behavior changes, some of them will last, as you said. Hopefully some of them will last. That will help the planet and the people to be better. And I hope this also wakes up a few corporates as well as governments to think a little bit broader on how they're going to help their citizens, how they're going to help their e-residents also to survive in times of crisis. So with that, I would like to thank you so much for your time. I think we went a little bit off the startup route, the usual route, but it was a definitely fulfilling conversation. And I tweeted you something. I asked you to change the Istanbul mayor, which probably you will be doing sometime soon. And hope we keep in touch. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you guys for having me.
Thank you, Sten, and thank you, Ozan. It was a great webinar and fireside chat. I'm sure a lot of startups will learn things from both of you. So have a nice day and stay safe.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.